Welcome to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. Join your hosts, Anita Russell, Mavis Bauman, and Gail Hunter, as we create a brave space for conversations about racism, personal transformation, and accountability. Conversation provides a means to dive deeply into your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs and examine what emerges in your words, actions, and behaviors. The show is a journey towards anti-racism by cultivating change within yourself first and then out into the world. Learn to engage in racial dialogue using 4 tools: courage, conversation, relationship, and accountability. Discover how truth, reconciliation, and healing can emerge from honest and deliberate conversations. Manifest social change right now on Inflection Point Podcast. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Inflection Point Podcast. I am your host, Anita Russell, and my 2 dear friends, Mavis and Gail, are with me as co-hosts. So Mavis and Gail, can you give a quick shout out?
You bet. Hi, it's Mavis. I hope you all got to read or watch something about MLK a couple of days ago. It's a good month to do that.
And I'm Gail, and welcome to this. And I hope you sit back and hear and listen and let yourself think about what's going on here. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So together, Mavis, Gail, and I make up the Anti-Racism Mastermind group, and we're actually your guides on this journey towards anti-racism. So we started this journey a while ago, actually, and now it's just continuing, and we plan on continuing it for quite a while. So we have been on this topic of identity and the power of a movement. So we've been talking about identity and how, particularly with Black folks, how our identity changes or has changed over the course of time. So we've been looking at these movements. We have like 6 movements that we're going to be looking at, we'll have looked at by the time all of this is over, but we've looked at 2 of them so far. And we looked at them asking this question: how has identity for African Americans changed across the spectrum of these 6 movements? So we started off with the Great Migration, which was around 1917 to about 1970. And then we talked about the Harlem Renaissance. And when we talked about the Harlem Renaissance, we actually talked about some particular individuals that each one of us kind of called out. So we talked about Ida B. Wells as an example. We talked about Carl Hansberry and Lorraine Hansberry. We all know Lorraine Hansberry from A Raisin in the Sun. And then we also talked about Zora Neale Hurston and the book that she wrote about one of the last Black men that were a part of the last cargo of slave in the slave trade in this country. And so we've had the opportunity to really have some really robust conversations about those 2 particular movements. So we've got a number of more movements to go. But what we're going to do today is slightly different, because what we want to do today is talk about how we connect our personal identity to these movements, okay? And each one of us is going to share a little bit about their own experiences, and we're going to talk a little bit about the story of Emmett Till. And we'll talk about how what happened with Emmett Till was a strong force in ushering in the civil rights movement that everybody knows of in the 60s, but you could take it back to prior to the 60s and look at the incident with Emmett Till. But before we do that, before we jump into that conversation, I'd like to start off by reading a poem. And this is a poem that I wrote very recently, and it kind of reflects how I connect my identity, my personal identity to these movements and all of this history and things that have been happening in the past, what's happening right now. So I'm going to read this poem to you. And the poem is entitled Being Black. I love being Black simply because I love that I was created in the image of God, who allows me to be creative in my own self-image. I was created to be self-determinate, to walk in love, to bloom where I am planted, to take root and produce fruit that others can eat. I love that my hair grows out of my head like a rainforest, long locks flowing down my back like pouring rain. I love the biochemical activation of melanin and the pigment it produces, a spectrum of color emerging as prismatic reflections of God's light, one just as beautiful as another. Now, what would I do or be or see or say without it? My Blackness, that is. How would I walk through the world? What would I miss? If given the opportunity, would I trade my Black for white? What would I have to give up to trade my Black for white? Everything. My identity rooted in the violence and brutality of slave ships, middle passages, and land filled with plantation crops. Yet I am strong. My language and culture rooted in soil from another continent, a far away place and a door of no return that I may never see. Yet I am proud. My resilience rooted in underground railroads and the passengers on the train to freedom, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, yet the struggle continues. My rhythm of life, rooted in sounds of Blackness, emerging melodically from one generation to the next, flowing from opera to rock, from blues to jazz, from rap to hip hop, from inspirational hymns to spiritual gospel, from the poetic funk of Gil Scott-Heron to the Motown sound of Marvin Gaye, to the Say Their Name chants proclaiming Black Lives Matter. Yet the sound of Blackness is still met with resistance. I love being Black simply because it's who I was created to be. I bloom where I am planted, taking root and producing fruit that others can eat along the way, knocking down obstacles that deny my humanity and fundamental right to exist in the skin in which I was born. Unfettered and empowered, dreaming and aspiring, designing my own identity, fulfilling my own purpose. I love being Black simply because of the 7 principles of Kwanzaa, the 10-point program of the Panthers, the protection of the Deacons for Defense, the cooperative economics of Tulsa, the battle for civil voting rights, the great migration across a nation filled with hatred, violence, and oppression against the oration of voices rising from the dust of the South into a national renaissance of culture, art, music, and literature. I love being Black simply because it's who I was created to be. I bloom where I am planted, taking root, producing fruit that others can eat along the way, knocking down obstacles that deny our humanity and our fundamental right to exist in the skin in which we are born. I love being Black simply because of the future generations who can eat the fruit that I produce because I took root and bloomed where I was planted as a creation of God. I love being Black simply because. So Mavis, Gail.
Yeah, that second time I've heard that, it is absolutely incredible, beautiful. I love it. I just, every word that you said, every word is just perfect.
So you see how it connects,
right?
me. And isn't that the whole point?
That's right.
One of the main points of what we do is that we all need to be connected to the history of this country. It's not just this person in isolation from that person.
That's right.
We're all connected to the same history.
And a history that we must look at in truth, accurately, with transparency. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to clap.
I know.
I wanted to clap for you, Anita.
You've got to get it published.
Right. You know what Anita didn't mention is she read this poem to Gail and I the other day and didn't tell us she wrote it. And when we found out she was the author, we just took a huge gulp of air because it just resonated so clearly, so honestly, and so beautifully. I don't think I've ever heard something quite like that. I love being Black from that perspective, from how we connect as humans and what your role is, who God created you to be, to knock down obstacles for everybody. And then I just hear this generosity of bearing fruit. I just think that that is so amazing after the history that we keep learning more about of African Americans in this country. They are bearing fruit. I, for one, could not imagine this country without the influence of Black history and culture. I just have always found it very rich, and there's just sort of I don't know, a naturalness about it that resonates with whatever rhythms were given to me. I just love this poem, and it's going to go down in history, Anita.
I believe so too. It is as authentic and organic as you are.
Yes.
And it must be heard by so many people because it is about what we need to begin to recognize and value, and the I am of who you are as who everyone, what the color of their skin is.
Right.
We all have to be able to step into that
pride. The pride that belongs to
resiliency, courage.
Everyone whose heart is beating.
Right. That's right.
Yeah, no shame, no hiding, no fear. None of that. We're done with that.
Yeah, and I know
that gift.
The place that we're in is going to call for people to really examine themselves within the context of what is my personal connection to what is happening in this country today. You all were both on the call earlier today. We were on a call with a long talk, and Kyle Williams worked to activate the anti-racism conversation and everything. And we started off talking about the insurrection and January 6th. And we had this conversation about what did that feel like for each of us. So there was a lot of people on that call, but just people sharing what that felt like to them, to have that experience and to watch that on television with your children, watching that unfold.
Tell them what you said, Anita, about it. Being at your front door. It felt like it was at your front door.
Yes. So I believe Kyle, he was just kind of asking us questions about, and he mentioned the danger, how dangerous that whole situation was. And what I commented on is the fact that when that day happened, It was under COVID conditions. All of my family was here, my daughters, grandsons, and, other people and all of that. We were just doing our normal thing throughout the day. And I just happened to have the TV on and everything switched over to what was happening. And all motion in my house literally stopped because we were just in disbelief of what was happening.
Yeah.
But what I commented on is when I thought about the danger and what was really dangerous about what I was seeing, that danger was very real. And it almost felt to me like that danger was right outside my door. Like that could have been happening 2 blocks down the street from my house. That's how real that danger felt to me. So Mavis and Gail, how do you respond to that? Or, when you realized what was happening, what was your initial response?
So I see why you would feel that way, because it was a dangerous situation, extremely dangerous. And as I was watching, I can remember because I somebody told me about it. I was working and a client told me about it. So I turned on, started listening to and watching it. And the first thing that I thought of was, if this was a group of Black people, they would have been treated so completely different than what this group was. And this group was a greater threat than anyone could ever imagine, whatever color skin you are, right?
Right.
Because this was a threat to democracy. It was a threat. I mean, it was shocking and terrifying.
Kyle Williams used the words mob mentality.
Yes, yeah.
And I think about how I took one class when I was in grad school about the ethics of behavior dissipating more as the group becomes larger. If you're in a large group, people tend not to feel like it was their fault. They're removed from owning that behavior. And so that mob mentality is a danger. In terms of that day, a friend from Guyana, called me and he said, are you watching your TV? And the first thing he said was, I can't imagine if this were Black people. And I was ashamed immediately because that was not my first thought. It was not my first thought. That's how white I am. It was not my first thought. And as I, kind of processed that whole event, I can't imagine 5 people of color with a Black Lives t-shirt on would have gotten even behind, the first gate without some injury. And, that tells us a lot about what our country is thinking and what's really going on behind what we're seeing at first glance. So I am quite horrified by the danger of it. And we have to address it. We have to address it in a loving, civilized, personal way. Yeah.
But that whole issue of if this was a Black mob, because they always refer to our protesting as mobs anyway.
Right,
even
right.
Even when it's peaceful, it's nonviolent, it's still referred to as a mob and that sort of thing. That's just a part of the lexicon in this country, if you will. But as we were sitting here watching it, the first thought that besides like, what the heck are they doing?
Yeah.
The first thought that popped into my mind, and we talked about it as a family, where are the police?
Right.
Yeah.
Because if you think back on Black Lives Matter protests,
Right.
how we've seen the militarized police in complete riot gear
For people walking down a public street.
Do you all remember there was one particular image that just really seared itself in my mind. And it was an image of a young Black woman who was standing nearly toe to toe with one particular officer in a line of officers, and they were all geared up. So that was one of the first things after, again, the initial shock of it all. was the fact that where were the police? They were not prepared. There was not like this preparation. And I'm saying that in comparison to what happens when there's a Black Lives Matter protest or some other thing that's related to Black folks or,
Right.
justice and all of that. The presence of the police was very different in this particular, in the January 6th situation. And I think anybody who couldn't see that, you might want to sit back. And I mean, no offense to you, Mavis, because you said you didn't see that initially. But anybody who can't, even after all the news coverage and all the documentaries and the January 6th investigation and all of that, that there are people out there who really deny what happened that day.
Right, right.
Whereas if it was the other way around and it was a Black mob, we would be demonized and demoralized to the utmost.
How many people would have been shot, killed, wounded?
Right.
Exactly. And the reason they would have been shot, killed, possibly wounded, whatever, is because the police presence would have been completely different.
Yeah.
If it was a Black Lives Matter protest, the police presence would have been completely different. That speaks to the racialized nature of the country that we live in.
Well, and I feel certain that a crowd of African Americans would have behaved completely differently.
It never would have occurred to us to go in and like try to take over the Capitol building.
Right.
Well, we've marched.
Starters, right.
As many times as we've had marches on Washington, we had the Million Man March. When did any
Never did that happen.
ever
No violence.
Right.
try to take over the Capitol and succeeded almost.
Right.
It required the mentality of white supremacy
Right.
to behave that way. Somebody that believed they were entitled to invade that Capitol.
Right.
No?
Yeah.
Right. And so that just goes to show you, when we were talking earlier today, it was one of the things was just this idea of white supremacy and how prevalent it is. And it's always been there. Like Kyle asked the question, like, at what point in your life did you know white supremacy was a thing?
Existed.
I've known it my whole entire life that white supremacy was a thing, because that thing impacted me and where I live and where I, play and all of that. It impacted me. But I think the main difference is there were lots of people who answered that question and basically were like, well, I just learned or I just heard about white supremacy in very recent times. Like I think of one or two people said since George Floyd was murdered.
Oh my goodness.
Hearing about white supremacy, or people associate white supremacy with Nazism and, and that whole entire part of history. But it's always been there.
It's always been there. And I think in a big way, subconsciously, I mean, if I had been asked, given a quiz or something, I wonder what I would have known about the elements that are a part of white supremacy. I probably wouldn't have. I was not hearing those discussions. Anyway, it's just shocking to realize, and it's important to acknowledge. It's so important to acknowledge. We can't do anything about things we can't acknowledge.
Exactly.
That they exist, right? Yeah. So, well, just even that January 6th event and not thinking about, that Black people were involved instantly. That changed me forever. Just that, I will forever see any altercation like that in some way that says, why is this happening? Where are the police in juxtaposition to who? What are people of other races doing? What am I seeing them do? Mm-hmm. And then it shows up in the news as someone else. So yeah, it's serious reality testing all the time.
It definitely
especially some of the gatherings after George Floyd was murdered. You could see the lineup of police and armed guards and so forth, right? And the people that were being very violent were a lot of white people in various different parts of the country, right. Not Black people.
Exactly.
And really, right.
Yeah, because if you remember when I told the story about how the Cairo question evolved, when my daughters were preparing to go in March in Pittsburgh, shortly after George Floyd was murdered. And my biggest thing was, this is what I said to them. This is your strategy. If things get violent, you come home. You come home. And I remember watching the news, because I had the news on the whole entire time, because they had the helicopters flying around and everything. So it was a constant broadcast. And I could see the point where it started to get violent. And, I'm in communication with my daughters and my nephew. It's like, okay, it's time for y'all to get out of there and come home. But what I found out later when they got home and we were talking about it, that it was white people who set those cars on fire.
Right.
They saw that with their own eyes.
Yeah, because they were right in the vicinity where it happened, where those, the police cars set on fire. And so it's this whole entire thing that protesting when it comes to Black people has always been associated with violence and looting and all of that. But at the same time, look at what we've experienced in this country. So if you can't understand that anger, if you can't, and I'm not justifying violence by any stretch of the imagination, but at the same time, that anger and that hurt and that pain is real and we feel it. Every time there's a news story on, we feel it. You could feel the rumbles through our community as something goes on. Mm-mm. It's constant.
It's constant.
It's constant. Okay. So it's just about time for us to go ahead and take a break. So we'll take a break, and then when we come back, we're going to start talking about the Emmett Till documentaries that we have been watching. And I'm going to go third. I'm not going to go first. I'm going to go last. So I would like Mavis and Gail to really talk about what they experienced, and we're kind of bringing it down to a really personal level. When you hear that story, what do you feel? What do you experience in your own body, in your own mind, your own heart? So we'll take a break and then we'll be right back. So welcome back to Inflection Point Podcast as we continue our current conversation on connecting personal identity to movements. And so Gail, Mavis, and I have spent a few days, maybe like a week or so, actually just watching some documentary films, two specific documentaries related to the death of Emmett Till. One of them is called Women, let me make sure I got this right, Women in the Movement. And then the other one is called Let Them See. So I'm going to start with Gail. And if you could tell us, Gail, what you watched, how did that connect with you? How did that resonate with you? And maybe if you even, for those people who may not have ever heard of Emmett Till and have no idea, if you could kind of give us the short version of.
Well, Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy who lived in Chicago. And he went down to visit his relatives down in the South. And he and a few cousins were at a store that was owned by white owners, a couple that owned it. And they allowed Black people to go in the store. But it was the South, even though this was in 1955. And it was only 14. I was 4 years old then. And so so the first connection was, oh my God, if he had lived, he'd be 10 years older than me. right? That was, I mean, that just made me crazy to think that this happened in the 1950s and continue to happen. So make a long story short, what happened was he was accused of sexually harassing the woman that was one of the owners of the store. And that night, in the middle of the night, the husband of this woman and another white man, they went to I believe his grandparents' house, his grandfather's house, and took him out of his bed in the middle of the night and literally, violently, brutally mutilated and murdered him and threw his body into the river with a fan tied around it so it wouldn't come up, but it did surface. And they did get the body. I'm not sure, I can't remember exactly how much time period went by, but the most, and there was a trial, right? But there wasn't a trial. It looked like a trial, but this was not a trial because both of these men walked away. They admitted that they had kidnapped him and even nothing was done about that. And then after they did a double jeopardy thing with the trial, so they couldn't retry them, they actually reported themselves as having been the murderers of Emmett Till. Emmett's mother, so the first thing that really struck me was the fact that he was 14 years old. I have two grown children, they're 39 and 36, but I remember when my son was 14 years old. And the thought of anybody doing that I can't imagine any adult treating a child, a 14-year-old boy, the way that Emmett was treated and killed, for nothing. I mean, for what really he didn't do, right? And
he whistled at the woman.
Right.
He whistled.
You know how many times, and when I was younger, that I'd get whistled? I mean, nothing happened, right? Yeah. And he was a kid, right? And his cousins who were there were horrified because they knew what could happen just from whistling, you know? But Emmett was from Chicago, and he experienced a very different way of being Black in Chicago than what his cousins were in the South, right? Yeah. So my first question was to the age of him and my own son. And then when I started reading more and watching about the trial, Emmett's mother decided to not have the body cremated or buried there. She wanted an open casket at the funeral. And she was, the courage that had to take and the bravery and she was determined to make sure that the world was going to know the truth and see what happened to her son because he whistled. And the body was almost unrecognizable. And it made a statement that eventually did lead into the civil rights movement. But it's just, I just can't imagine any human being doing that to a kid. I mean, whatever the cause was. I mean, this man had two young sons of his own, right? How would he feel if somebody had done that to one of them when they became 14?
But all of that just goes to show you how entrenched racism actually is.
And how dehumanizing.
Well, the dehumanizing, but when it comes to the dehumanization, I think the dehumanization is on both sides because you have to dehumanize and almost demonize yourself in order to be able to. So it's one thing to hate somebody, but it's a whole nother thing to evoke that level of brutality and monstrousness that emerges from within a person. That's the part that really blows me.
Believe that they had a right to do that. I mean,
right.
It just is unbelievable. And I can look at the history and I can see that at that 1955, the Civil War had been fought and emancipation and all that, but nothing had changed. In many ways, nothing had changed, right?
Nothing.
The belief system about Black people versus white people or humanity had not changed. And you could see how it got played out in the lynchings and how it got, and it still has been getting played out, right? And the difference of how police officers treat a Black 14 or 15 or 16-year-old or an adult versus a white person. I mean, it's still, we may not be doing lynchings, but Black people are getting murdered all the time.
I mean, think about it. We just celebrated the Dr. King holiday.
Right.
And what is the number one thing that the country is arguing over right now? Unrestricted voting rights.
Right. That's right. And
I mean,
still, and now we've got
irony, irony of that. I heard a statement, I believe it was Dr. King's granddaughter or maybe great-granddaughter, I'm not really sure. But she made a statement where she basically said, don't celebrate. Don't celebrate. What you need to do is legislate. You need to legislate the voting rights to get this whole ordeal off our plates. And just, people need to vote. Like, I don't even understand the mentality of an individual who believes that they shouldn't, that somehow one group, another group. But I think in a lot of ways, it kind of goes back to that whole 3/5 thing. When you think about when the country was, getting itself together and defining how, elections were going to be held. And it was this big argument over, whether or not the Black folks were going to be counted. And then they decided, oh, well, we'll count them as 3/5. They didn't ask us.
No.
And Mavis, remember the last time when we were in session and you read your grandfather's, or one of the times when we were in session and you read your grandfather's statement, that
it was all about slavery.
It didn't have anything to do with the people. They
had no voice. The slaves had no voice.
They had no voice.
Even though a war was being fought over them. Right.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
And I don't remember the memo that God said Black people should be 3/5, right? Counted as 3/5.
I didn't get that memo.
Yeah, I didn't get that one either. So, Mavis, your perspective and your personal story as you watch the Emmett Till documentaries.
Okay. I think I admitted the other day that I did not realize that the Emmett Till, the murder of this young boy, was really what kicked off the civil rights movement. And I would bet there's a lot of people in my white world that wouldn't connect the two. That was the year I was born, 1955. And it seems like not very long ago. When you put it next to your own life, the years of your own life, it seems so recent. When I watched the films, I was just in awe of Mamie Till's courage to even look at her child so mutilated, be photographed, be questioned in public by attorneys, dealing with insinuations that she might have had a life insurance policy on this boy and needed the money, or that Emmett actually physically grabbed this woman, which was not the case. Watching the perpetrators go to trial in front of 12 white men jurors, and there was no fairness in the room. It's like you say, Anita, the laws are written by the people who want a certain outcome. Mm-hmm. And so that justice does not flow to the people who were not involved in making those laws. I don't have children, so I don't have the same reaction that Gail does, but I just can't imagine taking anyone of any age and putting them in a state of terror. I was thinking about myself as a child. I was very, very sensitive child, very frightened child. If I heard anything on the news or saw something in a newspaper, I just took it in. And so I'm doing a little self-exploration on this because I was just so afraid until I was probably in college. I think that this as they say, you know, racism is not the shark, it's the water. I was in the water. It wasn't necessarily being directly explained to me, but I think I picked up on this and probably a lot of other things, the Cold War and all of that. Cuban crisis was one of my first memories. So I just think about now young children and what they're hearing about race, what's getting into their little spirits. What about children who are like me when I was little, very sensitive to the environment? I was just afraid to leave my house, afraid to sleep in my own bedroom, alone, you know, and depending on how dark it was. I mean, here's my neurosis, but it was a scary world, and it's still a scary world. And it doesn't have to be. We can address this. We can address this. We have all of the tools we need, our voices, the knowledge, the truth of what happened and how it's still playing out today. It's not just history. And did you already say today, history is a weapon? I can't remember which conversation, Anita, but history is a weapon. We need to look at history. And if we don't think that something really happened, look at it further, read more about it. I knew about Emmett Till, but not the way I know him now. Not the way I know him now. And I was also thinking about how he was a playful kid and just whistled. I don't know if his mom didn't give him the serious talk we hear about now, but he just whistled. And why that would be frightening, I don't know. I also noticed that the mortician broke some sort of regulation. It was in Chicago, I believe, that they had the funeral, right? I kind of get that mixed up. Right, he broke a regulation by agreeing to have an open casket. And so that one man changed the way that funeral happened and what people saw and how it got them to their core. So we need to not think that as one person, we can do nothing. We need to be open and watching and looking for that thing that we can do. So it's just tragic. It reminds me of, being in Rwanda and looking at the remains of those that were killed by machete. Yes. And there are some people who don't want to look. They just don't want to look. I want to look, and I want to know why. I want to know why. And I want to grieve with the families and find a way to turn that tide. Just turn it around. Ain't nobody want to suffer like that. None of us.
Right. One thing I do want to correct you on, at least according to the film footage, the documentary, that Emmett Till's mom was very resistant at first with him going, precisely because
she was
not familiar with the South, and she emphasized to him the South. We're talking Mississippi.
Oh,
it's
girl,
completely different, and you have to learn. So she literally walked him through, like some of the conversations that we've had when we're talking about, with the driving thing. She literally walks him through. This is how you conduct yourself. You don't look a white man in the eyes. As a matter of fact, you cast your head down. If somebody's walking, and she was quizzing him on it, at least the way it's depicted in the film. She was quizzing him. If you're walking down the street and there's a white person approaching you, what do? I step out of the way. Even if I have to step in the street. So she definitely
did prepare him,
educate him and prepare him. But he's a 14-year-old kid. And he was excited again, the way it's depicted in the film, he was very excited about going down South and spending time. And it was one other thing that really kind of got to me is the fact that the farm that they it wasn't his grandfather. I think it was like an uncle. I think it was an uncle.
Yeah, I couldn't remember. Yeah.
But they were picking cotton. This is 1955.
1955. Still
and they were sharecropping, and they were picking cotton. So for all those people out there who think of, the whole legacy of slavery, it's been over decades ago.
Right.
No, 1955.
Mm-hmm.
I was born in 1957. 2 years later, people were still picking cotton. I mean, just let that sink in, right? Yeah. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there, just to kind of correct that a little bit, that she definitely schooled him, because that's what we do. As Black mothers, that's what we do.
I'm glad you corrected me on that. I want to squeeze in a quick story about something that happened to me when I went to Omaha. Lived in a small town in Nebraska, went to Omaha and was in a shopping mall with my cousin, and a couple of young Black kids went by, and one guy grabbed me inappropriately in the nether regions. And I was so shocked that I really never spoke of it. I didn't tell my mother. I couldn't tell my cousin. She couldn't figure out what happened to me. And I told Anita about this some time ago, and she said, that was just some silly old kid. And I just couldn't think of that young man that way. And that's what he was. That's what he really was. Just out. He didn't hurt me. You're just a silly, inappropriate behavior. That's all. And I think that there's, I'm working on not rushing to judgment in that sense, If it had been a white kid, I would have been shocked, but it would have been a different experience.
It would have been a different experience. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. That's exactly the same way January 6th was a different experience.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Been just a completely different experience. So we're almost getting ready to run out of time, and I want to make sure that I get to share a little bit. So from my personal perspective, I relate Emmett Till. I relate everything to my little boy, Cairo. He's not my little boy. He's actually my grandson, but I relate everything to him because this show, my last book that I did, Cultivating Change from the Inside Out, all emerged out of asking this question, or my daughter actually asking me this question: will Cairo have to protest in his lifetime for the birthright to freely and peacefully exist in the skin in which he was born? So the way I see Cairo, I see Emmett Till in Cairo.
Yeah.
I see Trayvon Martin in Cairo. So I look at it from this perspective. Cairo's a little Black child living in the United States. And right now he's able to walk down the street freely and peacefully in his little red shoes. You've seen the video. He's in his little red shoes and he's simply enjoying life. Like he doesn't know anything other than enjoying life. But eventually he's going to be 6. Like Kaya, I believe I'm pronouncing her name correctly, Kaya Roll, the little 6-year-old girl in Florida who was zip tied and arrested by Dennis Turner, a school resource officer, 6 years old, and a girl, no less, right? And then eventually Cairo's going to reach the age of 12, like Tamir Rice, just hanging out in front of a community center. Somebody misinterpreted what he was doing, called the police. The police arrived. Within 30 seconds, that boy is dead. I see Cairo in Tamir Rice, right?
Sure.
And then he's going to reach the age of 14, just like Emmett Till. Just like Emmett Till. And so I see Cairo in Emmett Till, murdered viciously, right? In Mississippi. I see Cairo in that, which is the reason I do this work.
Yes.
Because I don't want that to be Cairo's life. Nobody wants that to be their Black child's life. Nobody wants that.
Mm-mm.
Nobody wants that.
Mm-mm.
So they all basically started off as children, just like Cairo. All of them.
I don't think people make that connection. I think
Exactly. And so it's kind of like young children like that, when their lives collide with a system that doesn't even believe that the difference between a child and an adult, that really matters.
right.
How do you zip tie a 6-year-old little girl and
Mm.
put her in the back of a police car and take her downtown, fingerprint her, and she's got to stand up on a stool so that they could take her picture? How do you do that? The monster lies within those
Yes.
people who have
Yes.
the capacity to do that to other children, to children.
Mm-hmm.
The system weaves lies about our children, just like it weaves lies about adults. It's a system that must be dismantled. Racism
Yes.
must be eradicated because my grandson's future depends on it.
Depends on it.
He has a right to live in his life as freely as my grandson does.
Exactly. Exactly.
There should be no distinction.
Mm-mm. I think in one of the videos I watched about Tamir Rice, on the police recordings, it said, there's a guy about 20 years old.
Exactly.
And he was
Provocation.
12.
He was 12.
And so the threat was communicated and it was wrong. It was wrong.
They didn't
And
shut
there's
him
that
up.
boy just gone. Car drove up and boom.
Boom, just like that. Like
Just
you
like
didn't
that.
ask a question.
Right.
You didn't, who
Mm-mm.
are you? Put your hands up, get on the
Mm.
ground.
Yeah.
Nothing.
How
You
is that
got
any?
out of the car and started shooting. How do you live with yourself?
I know. And how is that any different than the mentality that was going on in the 50s or the 20s or 30s or even before then? It's just a different means, right?
Yeah,
Right, right,
Same distorted belief system.
right.
Yeah.
right.
Just not
Same
value in this
injustice,
person.
right?
Right.
That's
So
right.
when you think about it, it's totally and completely irrelevant in which century
Right.
these
That's
things
right.
happen.
That's right.
It's just the fact that they
It is.
happen.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's the fact that they happen, and the reason why they happen is what we need to deal with. That's what we have to deal with, is why is it possible for a country that claims itself to be the best country on the planet, the richest country on the planet, et cetera, and we treat our citizens like trash.
Yeah. Our soldiers, even Black soldiers who come back.
It's the whole gamut.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
yeah, I just got the signal that we only have one more minute left. So I want to be cognizant of that. And so for the audience, I'm Anita Russell. My business is The Place to Soar, and you can just go and check me out, find out all kinds of information, what it is I do as a transformational life coach. I developed this activism through coaching model, which is being exhibited in some of these conversations. So theplacetosoar.com.
I'm Gail Hunter, and I'm a psychotherapist by profession, but I'm also the president of the board of OMA, Center for Mind, Body, and Spirit. It's under OMA, Pittsburgh.org. And we do a variety of different programs, and please go on and check it out and see all the different work that we're actually doing and desire to do.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I'm Mavis Bauman again, president of Seed a Better Life, a nonprofit that we've organized for the benefit of people who were impacted by the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda. And I am learning so much through this organization. We raise money for the education, health, and feeding of, all kinds of people there. It is so gratifying to just do even small acts. So I would encourage all of you to go to my website as well, seedabetterlife.org, and donate if you can, but for sure read and look at a few of the photos. You'll get the story. I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. So I'm pretty sure we're totally out of time at this point. So thank you for listening, and we will be back again on the first Wednesday in February. And just as an aside, beginning in February, we will start having guests on the show as well. So we look forward to seeing you, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. The journey towards anti-racism and social change doesn't stop here. Truth, reconciliation, and healing come from ongoing, open, honest, and deliberate conversations. Continue to dive in and deconstruct your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs as we band together to manifest social change. Tune in to Inflection Point Podcast every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, here on TransformationTalkRadio.com for more conversations about how we can cultivate change from the inside out.